Hi guys, and welcome back. Now let's go ahead and actually put into practice what we've learned about the network policy resource. So for starters, what we're going to do is kind of unravel some pieces to this. And we're going to start out by simply creating an empty namespace on a cluster, and then we'll spin up a database server pod running the MySQL database engine. And then we'll take a look at how we can control access to that pod by using a network policy. So if you've watched my other skill on the EKS CTL command line utility, if you're using Amazon Web Services, I'm going to be using that to basically just spin up a new cluster so that we have a sandbox environment to test out the network policy feature inside of. So join me over here in my terminal and we'll go ahead and get started. So I've already got a cluster up and running. I've already used the EKS CTL utility here to create a cluster on my Amazon Web Services account. And if I just do an EKS CTL list cluster, actually I think it's get cluster, I need to plug in my profile ID here as well, which is CBT. You should see that I have a single cluster here. So it's called Scrumptious Hideout. And of course, EKS CTL automatically configures my kubeconfig file for me. So if I just run kubectl and then do context, actually, let's do kubectx here. And you should see I have my context selected here for my Scrumptious Hideout cluster. All right, so now if I do kubectl get namespace, I've already created a couple of other namespaces here, but we're just going to create a fresh one. So I've got this MySQL client and MySQL and website here. So let's go ahead and just clean those up really quick. So I'll do a kubectl delete MySQL, and then we'll do the same thing for the MySQL client and website. Of course, I need to do delete namespace here. So namespace MySQL, and then we'll do the same thing for MySQL client. That should be client, but it's just misspelled. And then we'll do the same thing for website as well. And then we're going to create a fresh namespace here to kind of correspond to this diagram that we had over here. So let's just call it something like MySQL. Let me just do a kubectl get namespace here and make sure that those are all cleaned up. And it looks like they're not cleaning up instantaneously here. So I'm just going to do a kubectl create namespace, and we'll call this net policy. So that's the namespace that we're going to work inside of here. And then we'll do a kubectl. And we're going to spin up a new pod running the MySQL database engine here inside of this namespace. Let's do a kubectl, and then we'll do run --image equals MySQL latest, and then we'll expose port 3306 in the pod. It would be 80 if I was doing something like Nginx, a web server, for example, but MySQL uses port 3306. And then let's take a look at the help here as well. I just want to make sure I get this all correct. So I also need to specify a MySQL root password, otherwise MySQL won't start up. That's just how the MySQL container image works out there on the Docker Hub. So feel free to check out the documentation for it, but I'm going to specify an environment variable here called MySQL root password. We'll do env equals MySQL underscore root underscore password equals CBT123. That's just going to be my password to log in. And we also need to give the pod a name. So let's call it MySQL server. And I think that's pretty much everything we need at this point. So let's go ahead and run that. And of course, I need to make sure I put it in the correct namespace. I had a different namespace selected at the time. And so let's go ahead and put it in the net policy namespace. And now if I do a kubectl get pod, we should see that that pod is starting up here shortly. Let me just do a kubens. Let me do net policy here. We'll basically switch into the net policy namespace so I don't forget to specify that each time. And then you can see that this is up and running here. So we've got MySQL server, and we could do a kubectl describe on that pod just to make sure that everything looks good here. So yep, pulled the container image and it started MySQL server. And we, of course, have our environment variable with our root password set. And we should also have it exposed on 3306 here. And then we also have an IP address that was automatically allocated to the pod. And then right up here, you can see that it has a default label here. So it just says run equals MySQL server. However, we could actually add an extra label onto this pod, even though it's already been started up. So what we could do is run kubectl and then label, and then we could do pod/MySQL server. And if you take a look at the help for this command, you can basically just specify additional labels using key value pairs here. So let's go ahead and add on a key value pair like purpose equals DB server. And that should add that label onto that pod. Let's do a quick describe on the pod and just double check that that label was actually added. And sure enough, you can see right here, purpose equals DB server. All right, so at this point, we've got our namespace here, and we've got this pod created. And now what we want to do is basically spin up a pod that's going to kind of serve as our website here. So I'm not going to create a deployment and have all these additional pods spun up. I'm actually just going to create a pod individually instead of using a deployment controller. But then what we're going to do is attempt to access the database server that's running inside of our MySQL server pod here, and then we'll use the network policy resource to actually control access to that pod. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.